Namaskar. Today, under the banner of safety philosophy and principles of accident prevention, we will discuss storage and handling of hazardous materials. This total chapter will be discussed in 3 lectures. In lecture 4, today we will discuss concept of material handling. This lecture will cover introduction and objectives, hazardous material, safe storing of hazardous materials, fire and explosion risk, emergency action plan. After the session, you will be able to answer some of the following questions. What are the general hazards in industries? What are the kinds of health hazards? What is significance of safe storing of hazardous materials? And what are hazards associated with storing and handling of materials? As an introductory talk, we should know that dangerous goods are substances that when transported, they pose risk to health, safety, property or environment. Certain dangerous goods that pose a risk even when not being transported are known as hazardous material. Hazardous materials are often subjected to chemical regulations. Dealing with hazardous materials for manufacturing, transport and storage demand high level of safety. You may be remembering Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984 when an estimated 15 to 20,000 people died as reported by the government, and about 3 to 5 lakh people were genetically affected, and genetic mutations continued into their future generations as well. This is one of the scene actual picture witnessed on the day of the accident. The plant was not in operation for quite a few months, and it was faulty storing of toxic material that caused this massive tragedy. Similar incidents in history time and again which have proved to be eye-openers on the safety, health and environment impact. When hazardous materials are out of sight and in containers, one should be mindful of their storage. We do not know what is inside the container, but we know that there is a hazardous material. Naturally, we should be very much careful for their storage. If they are stored properly, these substances should not cause the problem. But unless we are all aware of what safe storage means and how to protect ourselves in storage area, we run the risk of accident. We cannot afford to take that risk with hazardous materials. So, you will be made aware of basics of safe storage of hazardous materials and the precautions we should follow when we are in those areas. By understanding regarding hazardous materials storage, you will also be saving not only your life, but also you can save life of your colleagues and the persons surrounding you, because you can very well tell them regarding the hazards, and they will also be aware about the safety risk. We will also be made aware about emergency action plan if hazardous materials go out of containment. Whatever safety precautions and the safety design we can have, whatever storage we can have, if there is a hazardous materials and there is a hazardous process, there is a likelihood of an emergency, and for mitigation of emergency, we should have emergency action plan. You will also be made familiar about some specific high risk substances so that you can better understand why we store these materials as we do. Rules framed under the Occupational Safety and Health legislations such as Factory Act, Explosive Act, Environmental Protection Act, etc. detail the location and the construction of rooms or buildings that contain these substances, including explanations of what can be stored with different types of hazardous materials. This last statement is very much interesting, that what can't be stored with different types of hazardous materials and what can be stored. What can't be stored means there are every hazardous material cannot be stored altogether. Different hazardous material are to be stored in a fashion as if they are compatible to each other. that is a separate subject, but for the for time being you should know that all the hazardous material can't be stored altogether. Every aspect of the storage room design has a reason and purpose. You shall be better able to understand that those storage areas and the substances stored in them are kept safe. A hazard is an agent which has the potential to cause harm to a vulnerable target. They may be natural or man-made. The substances we use and store can pose a number of different hazards if they are not handled and used properly and safely. The substances we use and store can pose a number of different hazards if they are not handled and used properly and safely. Here, wherever we talk about the hazardous materials, it is just like a baby newly born. Therefore, you have to take care of the hazardous material as if it is a newly born baby, because it needs some principle to be followed. It is not so that you will expose to the newly born baby directly to the hazardous environment. The hazard identification should aim to determine proactively all sources, situations or a combination of these arising from an organization's activities with a potential for harm in terms of injury or ill health. For example, a source. What may be the source? Source is moving machinery, radiation or energy source. Electricity may also be a source of energy, because whenever there is a joint or the connection or overloading, there is all possibility of a spark, and spark is a source of energy. Pressure itself may be a source of energy. So, such source of energy we should understand that they are posing significant hazards. Situations, that is working in confined space or working in height. X means manual handling or wearing the PPE, personal protective equipment, used whenever there is a significant hazard. How we are using the personal protective equipment, what personal protective equipment we are using, that during that particular activity it matters to reduce the risk. An example of X are manual handling as well as wearing personal protective equipment. Hazard identification should consider the different types of hazards in workplace, including physical, for example, slip, trip, falls, entanglement, noise, vibration, harmful energy sources which may lead to fire and explosion sometime. Chemical hazards, for example, inhalation, contact with or ingestion or chemicals. Biological hazards are contact with allergens or pathogens such as bacteria or virus. And psychological hazards are threat of physical violence, bullying or intimidation. There are many potential health hazards that can result from overexposure to hazardous substances to a length of time. In some events, the risk of hazard is minor, like a headache or mild skin rash while working in a rubber factory. At the same time, in other cases, the risk may be much more serious. For instance, skin burns from contact with corrosive chemicals. With some substances, too much exposure or prolonged exposure could cause organ damage, allergic reactions, cancers, or in worst case death also. Sometimes the risk is not just to individuals. Risk is not just to individuals working with or near the substances in questions. For example, a major spill of a chemical that is dangerous to health can pose dangers to many people if it gets into the water supply. If there is a fire or explosion that releases toxic gases, they could spread out to harm people in the neighborhood. There are so many such examples can be put together, that is that if it is danger anywhere, it is danger to everywhere. There are a lot of potential risks, including some very serious ones in any hazardous material storage area. Fortunately, there are also excellent safeguards against those risks becoming realities. Our storage areas are designed for safety and maintained for safety. That's the only good sense, and in many instances it also the law. Handling and storing materials involve diverse operations such as hoisting tons of steel with a crane, driving a truck loaded with concrete blocks, carrying bags or materials manually, and stacking palletized bricks or other materials such as drums, barrel and lumber. Efficient handling and storage of materials are vital to industry. In addition to raw material, these operations provide a continuous flow of parts and assemblies through the workplace and ensure that materials are available when required. Unfortunately, improper handling and storing of materials often result in serious injuries. The Director General of Factory Advice Service and Labour Institutes, normally called DG Fasili, under the Ministry of Labour, Government of India, had drafted a National Occupational Safety and Health we call in short OSH policy that industries are required to follow. One has to ensure that chemicals and dangerous substances are stored and handled to minimize risk and limit people exposure to them. If more people are there, then in case of any unwanted event, accident may happen and more people will be affected. One needs to assess the risk of storing and handling dangerous goods substances. This includes the possibility of environmental damage caused by leaks or spills. You cannot say that leaks and spills will not occur. There is always a probability of leaks and spills, whatever factors are the safer design it may be. Following precautions should be observed to control risk, such as storing chemicals or other hazardous substances according to the manufacturer's instructions on the material safety data sheet. Normally in short we call MSDS. Keeping the minimum quantity of hazardous substances needed. Storing incompatible substances separately. Incompatible substances are such substances, if stored together, they will cause a serious accident. Keeping a spill kit near the storage areas and ensuring that staff are trained in what to do in case of spill. Cleaning up and leaks or spills that occurs. They should be cleaned immediately as it leaks or there is a spill. Using the right personal protective equipments, train employees appropriately who store and handle dangerous substances. Checking that containers used for short-term storage are properly labeled. In case of fire and explosion, there will be a fire and explosion risk in handling hazardous materials. If you store chemicals or dangerous substances that could create a fire or explosion risk, you must also comply with the applicable industrial safety specifications and government rules. For example, IS 3594/1991 for general storage and warehouses and IS 3034/1993 for electrical generating and distribution in industrial buildings. Explosive Act and Explosive Rules 2008, Petroleum Act and the Rules 2002, the CEA Regulation 201, etc. These are some of the legislations and the government rules. Ensure that flammable substances are correctly stored in suitable containers and are stored near to a and are stored away from a source of ignition such as heater. This should never be stored near to a source of ignition. Now we will elaborate certain best practices for storage of hazardous material. You should follow the best practices described below for storage of hazardous materials. Place stores or the liquid above the ground level where they are unlikely to be damaged, for example, away from the traffic routes. Avoid overfilling containers. Supervise deliveries because the hazardous material should not be delivered to some other place. Maintain gauges, valves and pipe works. For example, normally if gauges are not maintained or not calibrated in time, then they will be giving wrong readings. Therefore, it may be showing or it will be very difficult to control the energy if gauges are not in order. monitor oil use. Unexpectedly high use may indicate a leak. Have procedure for dealing with emergency leakages. Use a secondary containment system such as a drip tree or bund storage area designed to prevent liquids escaping. Now we will think about the emergency action plan. Why? Because as discussed time to time, whatever safer design you can have, we cannot say that it will never be working in adverse conditions. There is always possibility of a emergency situations for a safer plant, for a safer product, even for a best safety professionals, they cannot avoid emergency situations. There is always a probability of emergency situations. In spite of taking all precautions, and unexpected situations may occur that endangers the safety of one or more individuals and entire premises. You will need to have an emergency action plan, EAP in short we call, in place for such eventualities. EAP of the organization will depend and have to be framed based on the types of industry, its layout, and the kind of possible hazards and other individual characteristics of the organizations. A statutory requirement for emergency action plan is under the section 41B(4) of Act 1948 as amended required that occupier to draw up an on-site emergency plan and detailed disaster control measures for his factory. Rule 13(1) of the manufacture, storage and import of hazardous chemicals, which is framed under Environmental Protection Act, require that an occupier shall prepare and keep up-to-date on-site emergency plan. Recently released ISO document 45001-2018 is a standard for the occupational health and safety management system, also requires the organization to establish, implement and maintain a process to prepare for emergency situations and to respond it if they occur. An emergency action plan has to be a written document. Plan can never be verbal. The purpose of an EAP is to facilitate and organize employer and employees actions during workplace emergencies. If there will not be any written document or EAP, then there will be a confusion and employer and employee will not be taking appropriate actions and they will be confused. Well-developed emergency plans and proper employee training such that employees understand their roles and responsibilities within the plan will result in fewer and less severe employee injuries and less structural damage to the facility during emergency. A poorly prepared plan is likely to lead to a disorganized evacuation or emergency response, resulting in confusion, injury and property damage. The minimum requirement of an EPA is that it involves taking what was learned from your workplace evaluation and describing how employees will respond. How employees will respond to different types of emergencies, taking into account the specific worksite layout, structural features and emergency systems. How to develop and implement an EAP? This is a big question because all the organizations want to have an emergency action plan, but they are not having appropriate skills for drafting the emergency action plan. Drafting an emergency action plan is not enough to ensure the safety of an employee. During emergency, responsible trained individuals are required to supervise and coordinate activities to ensure a safe and successful evacuation. A disorganized evacuation results in confusion, injury and property damage. If we talk of the implementation of emergency action plan, people will normally try to fight the fire, fight the emergency, but at the same time, in some circumstances, they have to flee. A fire is the most common type of emergency for which small business too must plan. Evacuation plans that designate or require some or all of the employees to fight fires with portable fire extinguishers increase the level of complexity of the plant and the level of training that must be provided to the employees. Shelter should be there in place for the chemical, biological and radiological contaminants may be released into the environment in such quantity and our proximity to a place or the business that it may be safer to remain indoors than to evacuate employees. Fire rescue and medical services. Although most of us quickly move away from the hazardous environments created during emergency situations, a group of dedicated and well-trained professionals, emergency responders and medical service personnel should be tasked with containing and mitigating these incidents, rescuing individuals at risk and providing medical assistance to the injured. Reporting of the emergency is also required for any emergency situations. Employees must know how to report emergencies. In times of crisis, there are various means of internal communication like intercom or public address system to notify the other employees. It is important for employees to further notify the authorities such as fire, medical or rescue services if your company relies on this type of assistance during an emergency. Now we will summarize the entire lecture in a few lines. In the session, efforts were made to make you familiar about types of hazards and hazardous material, their safe storage, safety precautions while handling the hazardous material, fire and explosion risk, best practices for storage of hazardous materials, and development and implementation of emergency action plan. In our upcoming sessions, we will discuss about process and principles of material handling. Thank you for listening the lecture.